His face went completely blank, not the blank of a man caught off guard, but the blank of a man who had just understood, all at once, exactly how badly he had miscalculated. I watched it happen in real time. The color didn't drain so much as it reorganized itself into something flat and stunned. My name is Nora Scott. And the man staring at me from across the conference table was my brother-in-law, Daniel Osei, husband of my sister Claudia, and he had just been handed 47 pages of loan records he had convinced himself no longer existed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't move a single muscle in my face. I set the bound document on the table in front of the family attorney, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start at a conference table. It started at a dinner with a comment about my car. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of crisp, clear afternoon that makes even difficult family gatherings feel briefly survivable. My mother, Ruth Scott, had moved into Maplewood assisted living 18 months earlier, after her second fall made it clear that living alone was no longer safe. The facility was good. Genuinely good, not a warehouse with carpet, but a place where the staff remembered her name and what television programs she preferred. It cost $4,200 a month. I had been covering the entire amount since the day she moved in. My sister Claudia and her husband Daniel knew this. What they chose to do with that knowledge was, apparently, nothing. We had gathered at Claudia's house for Sunday dinner, the kind of family obligation that comes wrapped in the language of warmth, but functions more like a status audit. Claudia's house was a large colonial in a suburb 40 minutes north of the city, purchased with, as I would come to document precisely, a significant portion of my money. Daniel worked in regional sales for a mid-sized logistics company. Claudia had left her job in human resources after their second child was born and had not returned to formal employment in 6 years. They lived, to all appearances, comfortably. They drove two newer vehicles. They took vacations. I drove myself to that dinner in a car I had purchased 3 months earlier. A dark gray sedan, not flashy, not cheap. A car that reflected where I was in my life. Stable, chosen with intention, paid for without drama. I pulled into Claudia's driveway. Claudia was standing on the porch with a glass of wine, and I saw the moment her eyes found the car. She didn't say anything immediately. She waited until we were all seated at the dinner table, my mother's empty chair held as a kind of emotional centerpiece, though she hadn't been able to attend family gatherings for over a year. And then, in the middle of a conversation about nothing in particular, Claudia set down her fork and looked at me. "I can't believe you're living too lavishly," she said. The words were measured, deliberate. "While Mom is in assisted care." The table went quiet in the particular way of people who have heard something they know is wrong but are not yet sure whether to say so. Her husband Daniel looked at his plate. Her friend Miriam, who had been invited for reasons I never quite understood, reached for her water glass. My Aunt Bettina, my mother's sister, the only other family member present, blinked twice, slowly, and looked at the centerpiece. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I picked up my fork and finished what was on my plate. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and went through the records I had been maintaining since 1998. To understand how I came to have 47 loan records spanning 26 years, you have to understand something about how our family worked, or more precisely, how it didn't. Our mother raised us alone after our father left when I was 9 and Claudia was 12. Ruth Scott was a woman of enormous dignity and extremely limited resources. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company for 31 years. She saved carefully, spent nothing frivolously, and communicated her values to us primarily through example. She did not discuss money openly. She believed that financial struggle was private and that asking for help was a last resort. This was both her greatest strength and, as it turned out, one of the mechanisms Claudia would later learn to exploit. Claudia was the older daughter and had understood from childhood that our mother's approval was a limited resource, rationed by behavior and performance. She was charming, socially confident, and very good at presenting the version of herself that served her best in any given moment. I was the quieter one. The one who read financial reports for pleasure, who opened her first investment account at 22 with $1,100 and a library book on index funds, who chose a career in commercial real estate because she understood, fundamentally, that real assets had real value. We were not enemies growing up. I want to be clear about that. We were sisters who had drifted into different understandings of what life owed us. The first loan I made to Claudia was in September of 1998. I was 24. She was 27 and had just married Daniel, whose charm was, at that time, more visible than his ambitions. They needed $3,000 to cover moving costs and a security deposit on their first apartment. I had it. She asked. I gave it to her, and she said she would pay me back within 3 months. She did not pay me back within 3 months. She did not pay me back at all. When I mentioned it gently, 4 months later, she said she thought of it as a gift. I was so stunned by the casual certainty of this revision that I didn't argue. I wrote it down instead. Date, amount, what it was for, what she had said when I brought it up. That was the first entry in what would become a very long document. I let that one go. People are complicated, money is awkward, and she was my sister. But I filed the information away with the precision I would later apply to closing real estate transactions, not out of bitterness, but because I understood, even then, that patterns were more useful than isolated incidents. What I didn't know was how deep the pattern went, or how long I would be the only one keeping the record. The second incident happened in 2004. Claudia and Daniel were buying their first house. The mortgage lender required a larger down payment than they had liquid, and Daniel had recently changed jobs, making his income documentation complicated. They needed $11,000. Claudia called me on a Tuesday evening and explained the situation with the particular fluency of someone who had rehearsed the call. She said it was temporary. She said Daniel's new position had enormous upside. She said they would pay me back within the year. I transferred the money the following morning. What I did not do was believe them entirely. I had by that point begun keeping a formal record, a simple spreadsheet with date, recipient, amount, stated purpose, and stated repayment timeline. I had also, quietly and without announcement, begun meeting with a financial advisor named Gerald Huang, who had offices downtown and who spoke to me in the straightforward language of someone who respected that I understood numbers. Gerald told me, at our second meeting, that gifting money to family without documentation was one of the most common and most costly financial mistakes he saw. He said it not to alarm me but as information. I thanked him, went home, and backdated my records to include the 1998 loan with as much detail as I could reconstruct. At that point, the total was $14,000. Claudia never mentioned repayment. Not once. Not in a passing reference, not in the reflexive way people sometimes bring up a debt to signal they haven't forgotten it. The $11,000 disappeared into her life the same way the first 3,000 had, completely, without a trace, as if it had always been hers. I didn't bring it up. What I did instead was close my first significant commercial deal 6 months later, a small retail property in the east side of the city, acquired through a partnership I had quietly been building for 2 years. The commission on that deal was $43,000. I put a third of it directly into a long-term real estate investment account that Gerald helped me structure. The family knew none of this. My mother knew I worked in real estate. She had no sense of the scale. Claudia knew even less, and I had begun to understand by that point that this was a form of protection. The third incident came in 2009 during the financial crisis. This one was different because it was my mother who called me, not Claudia. Ruth Scott called me on a Wednesday morning and told me with great difficulty that Claudia and Daniel were about to lose their house. The mortgage was underwater. Daniel's company had done significant layoffs. They had 3 months of payments overdue. I listened to my mother describe the situation. She didn't ask me directly for anything. She told me what was happening, and her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who believed children should not burden parents but who had no one else to call. How much? I asked. She told me, $22,000. I said I would take care of it. You're sure? She said. Yes, I said, don't worry about it. She thanked me. Then she said, with a warmth that almost broke something in me, you've always been the steady one, Nora. I held that sentence in my chest for a long moment after we hung up. Then I called Gerald, confirmed the liquidity in my account, and wired the money. Claudia called me that evening. She said she didn't know how to thank me. She said they would never forget it. She said that when things turned around, and Daniel was already in conversations about a new position, a better position, they would pay back every cent. The line about Daniel's better position was delivered with absolute confidence. I recognized the cadence. I had heard it before. I said, I know you will. I added the entry to my spreadsheet, $22,000, October 12, 2009. Stated repayment when Daniel's new role stabilized. Status, outstanding. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, someone who looked at you and saw only what they needed, you know exactly what that silence feels like. It is not defeat. It is data. By 2012, I had made 11 separate loans to Claudia and Daniel. The total at that point was $51,400. Not 1 cent had been repaid. I had also, in that same period, quietly acquired two investment properties, one of which I had already sold at a significant gain and reinvested. Gerald had introduced me to an estate attorney named Josephine Adler, who had begun helping me structure my holdings properly. She was meticulous, measured, and had no patience for sentimentality in a legal context. I liked her immediately. What I hadn't done in those 14 years was confront Claudia. The reasons were real and complicated. My mother's health was beginning to require attention, and Claudia was, at least on the surface, the one who organized family gatherings and maintained the social architecture of our small family. Disrupting that felt, in practical terms, like it would cost more than it was worth. I also believed, for longer than I should have, that Claudia was operating from a genuine but flawed understanding, that she thought of my money as something I had in abundance and she lacked, and that this imbalance made the loans feel, in her mind, less like debt and more like equalization. That belief dissolved in 2014. Claudia and Daniel had finished renovating their kitchen. It was a serious renovation, new cabinetry, high-end appliances, a custom island that she posted about on social media with the particular enthusiasm of someone who wanted to be seen. They hosted a dinner to show it off. I attended. The kitchen was beautiful. At some point in the evening, Daniel made a comment about a friend of theirs who had recently received an inheritance. He said, with the casual certainty of a man who had thought about this, "Money you don't earn doesn't feel real. It's too easy." He poured wine as he said it, not looking at anyone in particular. I looked at him. I thought about $51,400. I thought about 3,000 in 1998 and 22,000 in 2009 and every entry in between. I did not say a word. What I did the following morning was call Josephine Adler's office and schedule a consultation. Not about the loans, not yet. About something else I had been considering for some time. I had recently been tracking a commercial property on the east side of the city, a mixed-use building with two ground-floor retail units and four residential units above. The asking price was $1.1 million. I wanted to understand the structure of ownership before I moved forward. We met for 2 hours. At the end of the meeting, Josephine said, "You're well positioned. You should move on this before the market tightens." I did. The purchase closed in March of 2015. Claudia didn't know. My mother didn't know. Daniel certainly didn't know. As far as my family was concerned, I was a real estate professional with a stable income and a sensible apartment. A woman who drove modest cars and split checks evenly at family dinners. A woman who was reliable in a crisis. They were not entirely wrong about that last part. By 2018, I had begun keeping a secondary file, separate from the loan spreadsheet, more carefully organized. This one contained printed copies of every text message and email in which a loan had been discussed, every date and amount, and in several cases, written acknowledgments from Claudia herself in which she had referenced the money as something she intended to repay. These acknowledgments were not formal. They were offhand. But they were specific, and they were in writing, and they were time-stamped. Josephine Adler had suggested, at one of our annual reviews, I had been meeting with her yearly since 2014, that if I ever intended to formalize the outstanding loans, the most important thing would be documentation. Memory is not evidence, she said. Paper is. I had paper, a great deal of it. I also had, by 2018, two investment properties generating consistent rental income, a retirement account that Gerald managed conservatively and effectively, and a professional reputation in commercial real estate that was, without exaggeration, strong. I had closed four transactions in 2017 totaling just under $900,000 in gross value. The commissions on those deals alone exceeded what Claudia and Daniel had borrowed from me in total. None of this was visible to my family. My apartment was comfortable but not dramatic. I dressed well without ostentation. When my mother moved into Maplewood in 2022 and I took over the full cost of her care, I told no one the specific amount. I simply said I had it covered. Claudia said, "That's so generous of you, Nora." I smiled. She reached over and patted my hand. I noted privately that the gesture was identical to one she had used in 2010 when she had borrowed $4,000 for a car repair and described it, at the time, as a loan. It was entry number 31. The close calls during this period were occasional but real. The most significant happened at a family birthday dinner for my Aunt Bettina in June of 2019. Claudia had been talking about real estate investments in the abstract, the way people who don't understand markets discuss them, and she said to the table, "Nora, you should look into investment properties. You'd be good at it." My aunt looked at me with a slight smile. She knew more than she let on. I had told her years earlier in confidence that I had purchased a property. She had never disclosed this. I looked at Claudia. "It's a thought," I said. "The market's tricky right now, Daniel added, with the authority of a man who consumed financial podcasts without applying their content. You'd need significant capital to get started. It's not for everyone. I picked up my water glass. You're probably right. Was the truth, stated with complete accuracy, about a situation they understood entirely wrong. I had at that point owned 3 investment properties. The mixed-use building alone had appreciated by $240,000 since purchase. Gerald had recently suggested I consider a fourth acquisition. What I understood in that moment, the thing that settled into my chest like a key finding a lock, was that my family's dismissal of me was not carelessness. It was structural. They needed me to be smaller than I was, not because they were evil, but because the alternative required them to look at what they had taken and call it what it was. I let the dinner continue without a single correction. I drove home in my sensible car, poured myself a glass of water, and opened the loan file. 41 entries, $81,200. I did not feel angry. I felt precise. The second close call came in early 2021, during a video call I had arranged with Claudia to discuss our mother's care plan. We were reviewing the Maplewood contract and the monthly cost structure. At one point, Claudia said casually, "Should we set up something where we both contribute, make it more equal?" There was a long pause. I measured my words carefully. "That would be great," I said. "How much were you thinking?" She hesitated. "I'd have to look at what we have liquid right now. Things are a little tight." I nodded at the camera. "Of course, take your time." She never followed up. The contribution never materialized. The $4,200 a month continued to come exclusively from my account. What I didn't tell her, what I had no reason to tell her yet, was that 3 days before that call, I had met with Josephine Adler and asked her to prepare an initial assessment of what a formal loan recovery process would look like. Josephine had put on her reading glasses, reviewed the file I brought, and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she looked up at me and said, "Nora, you've been building this case for 23 years. "I know," I said. "Do you want me to move forward?" I thought about the video call I had scheduled for Thursday. I thought about Claudia's voice when she said things were a little tight. I thought about the kitchen renovation and Daniel's comment about inherited money and my mother's voice saying you've always been the steady one. "Not yet," I said, "but I want to be ready." Josephine nodded. She made a note. The file grew by another folder. That night, I transferred the full documentation, every loan record, every email, every text message acknowledgement to a secure digital archive. I also printed a complete physical copy and stored it in a fireproof box in my closet. Josephine had a duplicate. Gerald had a summary. The total, as of that evening, stood at $85,600 across 43 loans. I was ready. What I was waiting for was the right moment, or, more precisely, what I had begun to understand was that I was not looking for the right moment. I was watching for the moment when continuing to wait would cost more than acting. I did not have long to wait. The dinner in October of 2023 was that moment. Claudia's voice, calm and certain, in front of my aunt and her friend and the ghost of my mother's empty chair. "I can't believe you're living too lavishly while mom's in assisted care." That night I went home and opened the file. I counted the entries, 47. I added the 3 I had documented since the spring: a loan for a dental bill, a loan for a home repair, a loan toward Daniel's professional certification program. I tallied the total, $89,400. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called Josephine Adler's cell phone. It was late, but she had told me, years earlier, that I could call for anything significant. She answered on the third ring. "File everything," I said. "We're going with the original timeline." There was a brief pause on the line, then Josephine said simply, "I'll have the repayment schedule drafted by Friday." I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the city below. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No resolution music, no cinematic stillness. I poured a glass of water, stood at the window for a few minutes, and then I went to bed. The formal repayment notice reached Claudia's mailbox on a Thursday morning, 11 days later. I know this because Josephine's office sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, and the confirmation arrived in my email at 2:47 in the afternoon. I was in a client meeting when the notification came through. I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket. I did not check it until the meeting ended. When I looked at the confirmation, Claudia A. Osei, signature received, I sat for a moment in my car in the parking garage and allowed myself something I had not allowed in 26 years of careful, documented patience. I smiled, just once, just briefly. Then I put the car in reverse and drove to meet with Josephine, because there was still a great deal of work to do, and Claudia would not be quiet for long, and the conference table was almost ready for all of us. Claudia called me on a Friday evening, 4 days after the certified letter arrived. I was at my kitchen counter reviewing lease renewal terms for one of my tenants when my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring twice. Not because I was avoiding her, I had been expecting this call for 96 hours, but because I wanted to be sitting down and fully present when I answered it. Nora. Her voice was controlled, the kind of controlled that costs effort. I got something in the mail. I know. A pause. What is this? It's what it says it is, Claudia. A formal repayment schedule for outstanding loans. Outstanding loans. She repeated the phrase the way someone repeats a word in a language they don't speak. You're calling them loans now. I set down the lease documents. I always called them loans. You were there for every conversation. Nora. A shift in her voice, lower, almost conciliatory, the register she used when she was recalibrating. We're family. You can't just send, this is a legal document. You had a lawyer send me a legal document. I did. Why didn't you call me first? Why didn't you come to me? I thought about October. I thought about her voice in front of my aunt and Miriam, in front of the ghost of my mother's empty chair, living too lavishly. I tried talking, I said. For 26 years, I tried talking. She went quiet for a moment, then, is this because of what I said at dinner? Nora, I was worried about Mom. I wasn't criticizing you. I know what you were doing, I said. The repayment schedule is accurate. Josephine's contact information is on the cover page. If you want to discuss terms, that's the conversation to have. Josephine, the name landed with visible weight even over the phone. You have an attorney. I've had one for 9 years. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing. Then Daniel's voice somewhere in the background, low and unintelligible, and Claudia's muffled response covering the receiver. When she came back, something in her tone had changed, tightened like a wire under too much tension. We'll need time to review this. The schedule is on page 3. First payment is due in 60 days. I heard her exhale. It was the exhale of a woman who had not anticipated this version of her sister and was rapidly revising her assumptions. Fine, she said, we'll talk. I look forward to it, I said and meant it. We hung up. I went back to the lease documents. My hands were completely steady. The next 3 weeks were quiet in the way that precedes weather. Josephine's office received a letter from a general practice attorney Claudia and Daniel had retained, a man named Howard Fitch, whose letterhead suggested a solo practice in the northern suburbs. The letter questioned the validity of the loans, characterized several of them as gifts, and requested supporting documentation. Josephine forwarded me a copy with a single note attached. They have no idea what we have. I'll respond next week. I trusted her. I went back to work. The event that changed the timeline was not another phone call. It was my mother. I visited Maplewood every Sunday afternoon, had done so without exception since she moved in. The visits were sometimes long, sometimes brief, depending on her energy. Ruth Scott was 79 years old, sharp in her better hours and tired in her harder ones, and she knew something was happening between her daughters even though I had said nothing specific. She had the particular intuition of a woman who had spent decades watching her children closely because watching was how she had learned to protect them. On the third Sunday in November, 2023, I arrived to find her in the common room rather than her usual chair by the window. She looked up when I came in, and something in her expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, told me she had something to say. We settled in the corner of the room, away from the television and the other residents. She folded her hands in her lap, the way she always did when she was preparing to say something difficult. Claudia called me, she said. I kept my face neutral. When? Thursday. She said you'd sent her a bill. My mother watched me carefully. She said you were demanding money from her. I sent her a repayment schedule, I said. For loans I made her over 26 years. My mother was quiet. She looked down at her hands. How much? $89,400. She didn't flinch, she processed. I had always respected that about her. She did not perform reactions. She sat with information before she responded to it. She told me it was gifts, my mother said finally. I know she did. Were they? No, she nodded. Not quickly, slowly, the nod of someone confirming something they had suspected for a long time but had not wanted to look at directly. Claudia also said, she paused. She said you've been doing well financially, better than you let on. There it was. I had expected this too, but not this soon. I've been building something for a while, I said carefully. I didn't talk about it because I didn't want it to become complicated. My mother looked at me with an expression I could not quite name. It was not anger. It was something more like grief, with a thread of something else woven through it, pride, maybe, or recognition. She's asking me to talk to you, she said, to ask you to drop it. I looked at my mother's hands, folded in her lap. I thought about the call she had made to me in October of 2009. How much? $22,000. I thought about $4,200 a month. About the fact that my mother had never once asked where the money came from or expressed any discomfort about receiving it because she trusted that I had it, and she was right. Mom, I said gently, I need you to stay out of this one. Her expression shifted. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she unfolded her hands and reached across and put one of them over mine. Her palm was warm and dry and familiar. Be careful, she said, not a warning, a prayer. I will be, I said. I drove home from that visit with something cold and clear settling in my chest. Claudia had called my mother, had brought her into this, had used her, despite knowing exactly what my mother's health required and exactly how much stress she could afford to absorb. That was the line, not the comment about the car, not 26 years of unpaid loans. This, using our 79-year-old mother in an assisted living facility that I was paying for as a negotiating tool. I called Josephine from my car, still in the Maplewood parking lot. She went to my mother, I said when Josephine answered. A brief pause. Understood. Her voice had a precision to it that I had always found deeply reassuring. Do you want to accelerate? I want the full accounting ready, I said. Every document, and I want the meeting set up with the family attorney, not Howard Fitch, our family attorney, Graham Addo. I'll contact Graham's office Monday morning. Thank you. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. It was a gray Sunday afternoon, the sky flat and colorless, the bare trees along the road standing in their particular winter blankness. I drove the 40 minutes home in almost complete silence, the radio off, thinking about what came next. What came next was a family meeting. Graham Addo had handled the family's modest estate matters for 12 years, a quiet, methodical man who had known my mother since before I had retained Josephine separately. He was not my attorney, he was the family's, which meant he occupied neutral ground, which was exactly why I had suggested him. When I called him directly on Monday morning and explained that I needed a formal meeting involving myself, my sister, and their respective legal counsel, he was quiet for a moment and then said, in the careful tone of a man who had seen many family disputes arrive at his office, I'll send availability this week. The meeting was scheduled for the first Friday in December, 2023. Graham's conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, a room of dark wood and tall windows that looked out over the city in the flat winter light. Josephine was there when I arrived. Daniel and Claudia came in 8 minutes late with Howard Fitch, who carried a briefcase that looked significantly more expensive than his letterhead had suggested, and wore the expression of a man who had been told this would be a straightforward dispute. That expression was the first thing I noticed when they walked in. The second thing I noticed was Claudia herself. She had dressed carefully, a blazer, her hair arranged, the particular presentation of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument. She looked at me when she came through the door, and there was something in her gaze that I recognized, the assessment. She was taking inventory, calculating, the way she had been doing since we were children. I met her eyes and gave her nothing. We sat. Graham opened the meeting with the measured formality of someone who had done this many times and found the ritual useful. He summarized the purpose of the meeting to discuss the formal claim filed by Nora Scott against Claudia and Daniel Ose for outstanding loan repayment totaling $89,400. He noted that all parties had legal counsel present and that the meeting was being recorded with the consent of all parties. Howard Fitch adjusted his cuffs. My client's position is that the transfers in question were gifts, not loans. There is no signed loan documentation establishing repayment obligations. Josephine opened the folder in front of her. There are 47 separate transfers over a period of 26 years. For each one, we have the following: the original transfer record, the date and amount, and in 31 of 47 instances, a written acknowledgement from Claudia Ose referencing the money as a loan she intended to repay. She slid a tabbed document across the table. The acknowledgements are text messages and emails, all time-stamped, all retained in original format. Howard Fitch opened the document. He looked at the first page. He turned to the second. His expression changed, not dramatically, but the shift was visible, a slight flattening, a recalibration happening behind his eyes. Daniel reached over and took the document from him. He flipped through 3 pages and then set it down on the table with a little too much force. His jaw was working, the muscles in his cheeks moving in the subtle, involuntary way of a man who is furious and is aware that fury is not useful to him right now. Claudia looked at the document, then she looked at me. Those messages are out of context. They're verbatim. Josephine's voice was completely even. I mean, I might have said I'd pay something back, but that was just the way you talk. That doesn't make it illegal, Claudia. Howard Fitch put a hand briefly on her arm. A signal. She stopped. He looked at Josephine. Do you have documentation of the actual transfers? Bank records establishing the source? We have 26 years of bank statements with each transfer highlighted and cross-referenced to the acknowledgement documents. Josephine produced a second bound folder and placed it in front of him. We also have your client's mortgage records for the 2009 property transaction, which show an unexplained deposit of $22,000 approximately 18 days before closing. The timing and amount match the transfer from Ms. Scott's account precisely. Nobody spoke. 4 full seconds in which the only sound was the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system and the faint noise of the city 14 floors below. Daniel looked at his wife. She was looking at the folder. Her hand had moved to her collarbone, not dramatically, just a touch, fingertips resting there, and she was very still. "What are you asking for?" Howard Fitch said finally. He had recovered his professional composure, but the question had less confidence in it than his opening statement. "Full repayment of the principal," Josephine said. $89,400, plus interest calculated at 4% per annum from the date of each transfer. The total, as of today's date, is $119,211. Claudia's hand dropped from her collarbone. She stopped, started again. "That's insane." "It's the legal rate of interest," Josephine said. "We calculated it conservatively. We don't have that kind of money." The words came out of Claudia before Howard could stop her, low and curt and carrying the particular weight of a statement that has been true for a long time and is being admitted for the first time in a formal setting. Daniel looked at the table. He did not look at his wife. "That's actually what I want to discuss," I said. It was the first time I had spoken since the preliminary introductions. Everyone in the room looked at me, including, after a moment, Claudia. I waited until I had her full attention. "I'm not here to take money you don't have. I want to resolve this, not punish you, but I need something in return." Claudia's expression shifted, cautious, a flicker of hope threading through the tension. "I want a formal, legally binding acknowledgement that these were loans, that the money was never a gift, that the debt exists." I kept my voice measured. "And I want the repayment scheduled over 10 years, interest-free in monthly installments." Howard leaned toward his client and said something quietly. Claudia and Daniel exchanged a look. It was a complicated look, the kind between two people who have had a version of this conversation privately and are now facing the public version of it. Daniel leaned back in his chair, which shifted slightly under him, and said, "Why does the acknowledgement matter?" "If we're paying it back, because my mother is in a facility that I pay for." My voice was still calm. "Because for 26 years, I have been characterized to my own family as the one with less, while quietly covering debts that were treated as gifts the moment they were made. The acknowledgement matters because it's the truth, and I want it in writing." The room was still again. Graham Addo, who had said almost nothing since the opening, made a small note on the pad in front of him. Claudia was looking at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not anger, not calculation, something rawer, a kind of exhausted recognition. Her eyes moved to the bound folder of documents and then back to me. "You kept all of it," she said quietly, "for 26 years. "I kept all of it," I confirmed. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I considered the question seriously. I owed her a serious answer. "Because I hoped I wouldn't have to," I said. "And then because I understood I was going to." Howard Fitch cleared his throat. "Can we take 15 minutes?" Graham gestured toward the door. The three of them, Claudia, Daniel, and their attorney, gathered their things and stepped out of the conference room. The door closed behind them with a soft, definitive click. Josephine looked at me. She said nothing. She didn't need to. I got up and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the city. 14 floors below, people moved along the sidewalks in their coats, unhurried and ordinary. I watched them for a moment. Then I went back to the table and poured myself a glass of water. The 15 minutes stretched to 22. When the door opened again, the atmosphere in the room had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Howard Fitch sat down and arranged his legal pad. Claudia sat across from me, and for the first time that morning she was not holding herself with the careful posture of a woman performing composure. She looked tired, just tired. Daniel sat beside her and looked at his phone, then put it away, then looked at his hands. "My clients are prepared to sign an acknowledgement," Howard said. "We'll need some adjustments to the repayment terms." "Within reason," Josephine said. 12 years instead of 10. Josephine looked at me. I gave her a slight nod. 12 years is acceptable," she said. "Monthly installments, formal schedule notarized. Any default triggers the full outstanding balance with interest." Howard nodded. "Agreed." "We also need something else addressed," I said. Everyone looked at me again. "My mother's care." I turned to Claudia directly. "I have been covering the full cost of Maplewood for 18 months. The monthly fee is $4,200. Going forward, I'm asking that we divide that cost equally. 2,100 each, beginning in January." Claudia's mouth tightened slightly, then loosened. She looked at the table. "Yes," she said, "that's fair. And you will not contact her about this dispute again. Any conversation about the loan repayment, the schedule, or any legal matter goes through our attorneys. My mother is not part of this negotiation." Something moved across Claudia's face, not defensiveness. Something closer to shame. It was brief. She covered it quickly, but I saw it and I recognized it for what it was. "Okay," she said. Daniel finally looked up from his hands. His expression had settled into a careful blankness, the blank I had seen at the beginning of the story, when I had first watched comprehension land on him like a stone. How did you? He stopped, reconsidered. The properties, the accounts, how long? I looked at him. Since 2004, I said. Gerald Huang helped me structure it. I started with $1,100 and a library book. He looked back at the table. Something in his posture changed, not collapse exactly, but a kind of deflation. The particular diminishment of a person who has spent years making pronouncements about money and is now required to sit in the same room with the evidence of how wrong they were. Josephine and Howard spent the next 45 minutes working through the formal language of the agreement. Graham witnessed. I signed where indicated. Claudia signed, with Howard guiding her through each page, her pen moving carefully and without drama. When it was done, Howard Fitch collected his copies and stood. He shook Josephine's hand. He shook Graham's hand. He looked at me briefly and said, with what seemed like genuine acknowledgement, "Miss Scott?" Then he left. Daniel stood and put on his coat. He did not look at me again. He walked to the door, opened it, and waited for Claudia. Claudia stood. She gathered her bag slowly. At the door, she stopped and turned back toward me. The room was quiet. Graham was reviewing something at the far end of the table. Josephine was organizing her folder. I didn't think of it as debt, Claudia said. Her voice was different, no performance in it, no management. I want you to know that. In my head, it wasn't, I didn't think about it that way. I looked at her. I know, I said, that's part of the problem. She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded once, turned, and walked through the door. It closed behind her. Josephine clicked her pen and put it in her bag. That went well, she said. It did. I picked up my copy of the signed agreement. Thank you, Josephine. It was well documented, she said, which was the closest she came to a compliment, and I took it. Graham walked me to the elevator. In the lobby, he shook my hand and said, with the measured warmth of a man who had spent decades watching family situations deteriorate and appreciated the ones that didn't, "Well handled, Nora." I thanked him and stepped out into the cold December air. The first repayment installment arrived by electronic transfer $827.92 on schedule on the 14th of January, 2024. I saw it in my account at 6:15 in the morning before I had finished my coffee. I looked at it for a moment. Then I transferred $50 to my mother's personal account at Maplewood, the discretionary fund she used for the small pleasures the facility offered. A magazine subscription, a piece of jewelry she had admired, Tuesday afternoon coffee with the friends she had made there. My mother called me that evening to thank me, confused about where the deposit had come from. Just something extra, I said. She made a small sound of contentment. You're too good to me. You raised me well, I said. That's different. The consequences for Claudia and Daniel unfolded over the following months in the particular way that financial realities tend to unfold, not dramatically, but steadily in one direction. The monthly payment was, for people living at their level of expenditure, not a trivial amount. Daniel's position at the logistics company went through a reorganization in February, and though he kept his role, the bonus structure changed significantly. Claudia, in a conversation I heard about secondhand through my Aunt Bettina, had begun looking at returning to work. The kitchen that had been the subject of the social media posts in 2014 was apparently being repurposed as a home office. I did not feel satisfaction at any of this. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was something simpler and less interesting than satisfaction: relief. The particular relief of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down in the right place. My Aunt Bettina called me in March. She was the only family member who knew the full shape of what had happened, and she had the grace to ask about it directly rather than approach it sideways. "Are you and Claudia going to be all right?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not carrying it for both of us anymore." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough." My professional life continued without interruption. The mixed-use building on the east side appreciated further. Gerald and I had a conversation in the spring about an additional acquisition, which I was still considering. The monthly payments from Claudia and Daniel arrived on schedule every month, deposited quietly into an account I did not think about very often because it did not need thinking about. Josephine's office monitored the schedule and would notify me if anything changed. My mother, as of this spring, is doing well. Her Sundays are still mine. We drink coffee in the corner of the common room, away from the television, and she asks about my work in the way she has always asked, interested but not probing, proud in the understated way of a woman who expressed most things understated. She has not mentioned the dispute since November. I have not raised it. Some resolutions do not need to be discussed to be real. Last month, she reached across the table, put her hand over mine the same way she had in November, and said, "You seem lighter." "I am," I said. She smiled. We finished our coffee. I drove home. So did I go too far or was I justified? Tell me in the comments.